Move into a panel discussion now with some special guests that are giving up out of their very, very busy schedule some time to come and talk to us here this morning. So first of all, I have to tell you that sadly, Monique Ryan has had to withdraw from this panel. She was very keen to be part of it, I have to say. But the election announcement recently has created extra time pressures for her and her office, and she's needing to stay focused in her electorate. But it does give me huge pleasure to welcome the Honourable Marie Edwards, MP, who is, would you like to come up, Marie? Yeah. We can come up here. Who is the Victorian member in the Victorian State Government, member for Bendigo West. and she is representing here today also the Victorian Minister for Climate Action, who is the Honourable Lily D'Ambrosio. And online, if we can have our online guests, please. Good morning. Good morning, good morning. We have Senator Steph Hodgins-May, who is the Federal Senator for Victoria, and we have Jade Benham, MP, who is the Victorian State Member for Mildura.
Good morning.
So we know, and we've already heard, and Marie has been in the room for a little while there, has heard a little bit of our conversation, that the impacts of climate change are not gender neutral. Women suffer significant and longer-term impacts because climate change amplifies existing gender inequalities and poses unique threats to livelihoods, health and safety. Meanwhile, climate and environmental policy is often silent on questions of gender equality, and gender equality policy often neglects climate and environmental issues. We also know that as community carers, the presence of women in decision-making is linked to stronger and more effective environmental action, as well as an increased focus on gender-specific environmental impacts. And there is good data to back up both these claims, and there are people in the room here who can vouch for that. So even though we now celebrate increasing numbers of women in governance, and in fact Chloe, who just gave us a little bit of a sum up from yesterday, put this really well, we still tend to measure in terms of women, we tend to measure in terms of the number of women who are in positions in government or business or whatever it is, whereas maybe we could be using other measurement parameters about how much actual real say we as women are having, and maybe we should be looking to find ways to measure that as well. That's a little bit of an aside, sorry to our guests. So the numbers of women are definitely have increased, but we can still see that we do have fault lines in our systems of governance, and these are detrimental to women and men alike. So we think it's important for women to come together to explore our policy priorities and ways of organising and leading, and that's what this Congress has been about. This is in no way to relinquish any individual political perspectives to membership, but to look at how women can maybe work together to really explore our ideas with other women through a gender rather than just always a political or ideological lens. So this session is sort of a way, in our events and in the past we've done this to bring together women from different political perspectives to talk about how we can foster an open, constructive dialogue among women parliamentarians and explore the potential for more collaboration on issues that impact women. So I'm going to turn to I'll turn to Marie. Is it okay if I call you Marie?
I've been called a lot worse.
All right. Okay, so, well, I'll start. With so much at stake in the next few years, can we create a new kind of conversation around action on climate change that can bring people together across different worldviews in constructive ways?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Jana. And can I thank you for the invitation to be here with you this morning, acknowledge the traditional owners, the Dja Dja Wurrung, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and any First Nations women who are joining us here this morning in our beautiful Castlemaine Town Hall. So I'm very excited to say thank you to begin with, because it was wonderful to hear that the Women's Climate Congress was going to be meeting here in my patch in Castlemaine, in Bendigo West. So welcome and thank you. Thank you for bringing that conversation and those conversations that you've been having to Castlemaine, and a big welcome to those who've travelled far and wide to enjoy everything we have to offer in our beautiful part of the world. That is a very big question. It is a very big question. And I might just go quickly back to where I'm coming from, in the sense that I am a Victorian government member. I'm also the Speaker of the House in the Legislative Assembly, so I have a big job. And I see a lot of things happening in the Parliament outside of what most people think is happening in the Parliament, and that is that aggressive debate that you often see in question time, which is, the most challenging part of my day, mostly. But what I do see outside of that is women coming together in all sorts of different ways. It might not necessarily be focused on climate change, but I do know that women cross-party do meet and do collaborate on a whole range of different things. From my perspective, you mentioned women in numbers. It does make a difference. It absolutely makes a difference. The government has more women than men. The government cabinet is over 50% women. We have the only woman Minister for Climate Change. It is making a difference. It does make a difference. And we can see that with the progression that Victoria is making in terms of climate change, because we are in fact leading the nation. But I'll put all that aside for the moment, because I think the question you're asking is, how do we better collaborate? At the political level, I think that's really challenging. I think it's really challenging because we all come to the table with different ideologies. And unless you can admit that climate change exists and that we have a problem, then you're never going to have collaboration. So I think that is a big starting point, to have everyone at the table talking about the same things, the same issues. Locally, I know that we have many women in this community, whether it be Castlemaine or Bendigo or the many small communities that I represent, who are talking about climate change every single day. And at that community level, there is broad cross-party, if you want, cross-ideology collaboration, because it is the women in the rural communities that I represent who are faced with the impact of climate change, whether that be floods, whether that be fires, whether that be terrible weather events. And just last year, this town of Castlemaine, for the first time that has ever been recorded, was covered in white hail. We had the biggest hailstorm that this town has ever seen. It looked like snow on the ground in the main streets of Castlemaine, never been seen before. So we know that there are huge climate change events happening right here in our own communities. How we address that, how we get people to the table to collaborate, is a really difficult question to answer. For my part, I'd be happy to have those conversations, and with colleagues in the Parliament. I have conversations though with my local community members, and particularly women in my local community, who talk to me all the time about what we can do better and how we can address climate change more broadly. Women are impacted more, definitely. I have a son in Queensland and a daughter-in-law. They have 5 kids. One of them is a little baby who was born in December, my 12th grandchild. Speaking of population growth, sorry. But they were flooded in, and the baby was sick. They had no way to get in and out of the town that they live in, and they had nowhere for the helicopter to land to bring in a specialist to help the baby. So these things do impact on women and children in particular. There are bigger issues that obviously we should be talking about. But I think it's very clear that the impact on women is felt more at a personal level than it is for others, and particularly for children and families as well. But I think collaboration is absolutely something we should all be thinking about. At the federal level, I'm not quite sure how that all works because, you know, that's not my thing. But certainly at the state level, there are big opportunities. And I know that it does happen outside of the chambers where women members come together and discuss a whole range of different issues. And I know the government, which I am a member of, we do have a women's caucus. And we do talk about a whole range of different things, including when we put in budget submissions, that we have the gendered lens over everything that the government does, but we also have a lens of environment and climate change and a whole range of other different issues when we're putting in budget submissions to the Treasurer. So I'll leave it at that because I could talk all day, sorry.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we might follow up on some of those points in a minute, but you mentioned what happens in the federal parliament, so I might turn to Steph now. Same question, Steph. How can we create new kinds of conversations around action, particularly with women? The women here yesterday, a lot of the conversation yesterday was about collaboration, thinking how can we work together, and women are good at that, you know, so over to you, Steph.
Yeah, look, thank you so much, Janet. And I'm so sorry I can't be there in person today. I was really looking forward to being there in the room until the election was called, as we know, last week. My name's Steph Hodgins-May. I'm the Green Senator for Victoria, and I grew up on beautiful Dja Dja Wurrung country in Blampede in central Victoria, so very familiar with the landscape, and I'm now calling in from Kulin Nations land in St Kilda, and acknowledge the deep and ongoing connection of our First Nations people to land, to culture, to the waterways, and really, I think on behalf of all of us, recommit to healing those wounds of colonialism that run deep in the veins throughout this country. So thank you for having me here today. Really, around new conversations, look, I bring to this role significant experience working in the regions, right through to international diplomacy. And I'm so fortunate to have worked incredibly closely with diverse women across the spectrum. You know, most recently before entering Parliament, I worked with Greenpeace International, and I worked as the head of Pacific climate litigation in the Pacific Islands. And, you know, these are nations on the absolute forefront of the climate crisis. Just last year, I was in Vanuatu on a cross-parliamentary delegation and standing out the front of a hospital that the previous year they'd had two cyclones and had water lapping at their ankles. And, you know, it's very much a lived reality for these people. Through to where I grew up in central Victoria, you know, we're experiencing drought at the moment. And I think the conversation has never been more critical, but even following the conversation, the action that needs to be taken. And I do find that I've been in lots of forums where there is really meaningful dialogue, particularly between women, whether it's, you know, in the Parliament now, where I'm really fortunate also to be part of a party room that is predominantly women. We've got First Nations representation, we've got Muslim representation, but ultimately, most of the spaces that we work in the federal parliament don't include the diversity of voices that we need to ensure that we're really addressing the multitude of gender-based responses that are needed to confront the climate crisis. And I'll acknowledge I've worked in some excellent cross-parliamentary groups where predominantly women, we've worked on solutions and we've mapped a pathway towards action, but many times that hits obstacles when it leaves that group of women and is escalated to a cabinet or to a male-dominated decision-making forum. And I think maybe one example, and try not to get too political, but we are very close to a federal election, but we saw our nature laws recently. A member of my party, our environmental spokesperson, worked incredibly closely with the Environment Minister and, you know, had worked and developed a stronger environmental protection authority. And we were almost about to sign on the dotted line, and unfortunately that was overturned by someone else, by a male who really wasn't, I think, part of that dialogue and shouldn't have intercepted at that level. But I see it regularly, whether it's issues around women's reproductive rights right through to protecting our environment. I think women get it, by and large we get it, but unfortunately at those higher structural power levels we're just being trumped. So it really needs to start at a community level, and that's the part I like about my job most. It's travelling around the regions right across Victoria and listening to women in regional Victoria, listening to multicultural communities. I was out in Dandenong last weekend and meeting with the Sikh community and the Hazara community, and really trying to absorb as many of those different perspectives on climate, on gender, on environmental justice, and taking those into the parliament. And that's what I see my responsibility as being. But I think one of the other issues we're up against is incredibly short electoral terms. You know, people get elected and basically the day after they're elected, they're already campaigning to remain elected at the following election. And so I'm really, I think one of the key things that we need to tackle in the next term of parliament is getting fixed parliamentary terms in the federal parliament. I talk to people right across the political spectrum and they agree, so I'm not quite sure why we haven't gotten there yet. But, you know, also as a woman who ran in elections previously, like when you're trying to plan a family and have children, it's an incredibly large barrier to participation when you don't know when there's going to be a federal election. I was heavily pregnant during the last campaign and I don't recommend it. But I think it's some more certainty for women through those fixed terms. I think I don't know if the other parties have quotas around the sort of representation that is within their party rooms to ensure that we're including that diversity of voices that I think is critical to good decision making and good policy making. I think they're probably the ones that come to the front of my mind, but we've got an enormous amount of work to do. And as a mother of a 2-year-old and a 7-year-old, that's really what drove me to this parliamentary space. And I think that the more time we spend in our communities, the more time we spend in groups of women like this, the more caucusing we do, the more coalition building we do, the stronger that our voices become. And I've only been in the parliament less than a year now, and I'm told that when we're not so close to an election, there is a greater degree of collaboration and cross-party work, and I'm really looking forward to embracing that. If I'm re-elected, I'm up for re-election in 5 weeks' time. But yeah, it really starts at the community level and changing those structural barriers that exist at the top. So yeah, I'll leave it there and maybe pass to Jade.
Thank you. So, thank you. So I'll go to Jade now, pick up on the points about creating better conversations and collaboration.
Yeah, thank you, Janet. And again, I'm sorry that I can't be there in person also, but it is a long way from the tropical north of Victoria. But just to pick up on a few things that that Marie and Steph have mentioned, Marie's absolutely right. Collaboration happens now, particularly with the women, I think, cross parties in the Victorian government. There's always conversations happening with regard to lots of issues. And I think that comes from women having a level of empathy for one another, but also being professional in our workspace as well, and the vision for the greater good. I guess that's where that comes from, and the willingness to be able to work toward the best outcome for everyone. I'd like to think that that's where it comes from for me anyway. Of course, I can't speak on behalf of others, but I certainly do and have worked on being able to collaborate with whoever it is, to be able to, and whether that's regarding, policies out in rural and remote regions, which is what I cover 16% of Victoria, and a lot of that is very rural, very remote. So our perspective is a little bit different, and I think there has been a sense recently that even though as the Nationals, our policy comes from the grassroots, it comes from members who are out there living day to day. There is, I think, they're not a small section of the community, but the women out who are already very remote and feel very, very isolated, whether it is after they've just had a baby, you know, having a baby is difficult enough, particularly when it's your first, without having that social connection. You could be, you know, half an hour from the nearest town, etc. Women's perspective out in those areas can be very, very different. And I think at the moment there has been lots of conversation about climate change and about a move to renewables and being self-sufficient within your own worlds, I'll say, but your own properties that can be quite vast. But there is a feeling that there has been a bit of a lack of collaboration with the women who are essentially, a lot of the time the women will know that they are, you know, they run the household, they're making a lot of the decisions, they are out there raising the kids. They're women that I will say farming women, particularly those that are out in those isolated areas, are powerhouse forces of nature because they have got a lot on their shoulders. But at the moment, they've been, I think, driven to a point where they've actually had to come together, which is a great thing, because they feel like they're not being listened to. So I think that with regard to the question, how can we collaborate differently? I think listening is the very first thing that we have to do, but listening to all groups, and this Congress is a great example of that, listening to perspectives from across the spectrum, because there is a group out in remote Victoria, particularly at the moment, and remote Australia perhaps, that feel like they're not being heard. And these are the ones that are being approached now, and they agree that we need to move to a cleaner future, and they're aware of climate change, and they're doing all sorts of things to move to cleaner, greener energy and those sorts of things. But they are very, very concerned that they will be left without choice of what happens with their land and the generational farms that they've had. So, and that then comes with a whole other host of issues around, you know, the very fabric of those communities that are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, but those community members that are left, particularly the women that are carrying a huge load day to day, but put on a smile and lipstick and carry on a lot of the time, the strain is getting almost too much to bear. So that's where groups like Farms for Food have come from, who are doing a power of work now, and that's led by 4 women who've come together. So I think in times of need, women will come together and they will find their people and they will listen to one another in the hope that a group of their voice will be amplified. So I think, coming back to the question, the first thing we have to do is listen, and listen to everybody, because things like we're seeing overseas at the moment, I think particularly in the United States, when particular groups are not listened to, then there feels like there's an uprising of those ones that feel they're being ignored, and that can be quite scary sometimes. So yeah, I think, coming back to the question again, I think listening and empathy is probably the best place to start as women.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So just picking up on all of those points, a couple of our members, a couple of years ago now, sort of got a research project up through the Parliamentary Library to look at women's caucuses, and I'm not talking about Labour caucuses or party caucuses, I'm talking about across party, internationally. And that piece of research actually showed that about 90 other, I'm going to say countries, but it's jurisdictions overall, and certainly most countries culturally similar to us, have women's caucuses in their parliaments, and Australia never has had one, and none of the state governments have either. Maybe occasionally there's been a coming together over a particular issue, and then that hasn't. In the early days, certainly, because in America, there was a women's caucus was formed there in 1973, I think it was, and it was because there were so few women in the parliament that women kind of felt that they were they represented their electorate, but they also represented women more broadly. But I think maybe as more women have come into Parliament, that sense has been lost a bit, because women, they feel they are represented because we have more women. But that feeling of representing women with women is still important. We've just heard it there in what Jade's saying, and what all of you have said to some extent. So I might turn back to you, Marie, maybe you could.
Sure.
Yes,
that was a federal research project, was it, for the federal parliament? Yeah. We've never really done that. Not in my time. I've been the member for 15 years now, and I don't recall ever seeing a cross-party caucus focused on a particular issue, except perhaps for the parliamentary friends groups, where members cross-party come together to form friendship groups in relation to particular organisations or countries. But it's an interesting one, because I think it goes to the heart of what I said at the outset, that there are some issues, like we have globally a very distinct movement away from the centre. We have movement to the right and we have movement to the left. And there's very little in the centre. And you can see that very much, as Jade said, in the US. It is similar in Australia. And I'd like it not to be that way, but the reality is that we are seeing very diverse views from different aspects of the political divide, particularly around climate change. There is no question about that. There are some who would move towards extreme measures, and I'm going to be a little political here, but extreme measures around the introduction of nuclear energy, and there are those who want more renewable energy. So we have this divide, and it's very hard to transverse that and say, let's all come together to discuss the impacts of climate change on women and how we can better address that, when there are some who don't even admit that climate change exists. So that it makes it very challenging, right? It makes it really hard. Personally, for me as Speaker, it is something that I would like to look at, because I think it's probably incumbent on me as the Speaker of the House to maybe bring the women's caucuses together. Yeah? It's a big job. But just on that, because women have come together in the Parliament around a whole lot of different things, and I mentioned that earlier, and just recently, and Jade will back me up here, but we have just opened our first child minding centre in the Victorian Parliament. So that came about through cross-party advocacy. So we've got 5 new babies in the Assembly, and it was thanks to the advocacy and the support of myself and the Secretary of the Department. So a National, a Liberal and a Labor member, all with babies, who needed somewhere to have those babies looked after while they were in Parliament. So it does work. It can work. But it can only work if there's genuine collaboration. And it's not just tinkering around the edges, that there has to be thoughtful and considered approaches to bridge that ideological divide, because it exists. And I'm not sure how you address that, but I'm willing to give it a try. Thanks.
And there are ways that you can sort of set up conversations, as we're trying to do here, to even with, facilitation or mediation or whatever, to help these conversations along. But I'm going to toss that question to Jade now, I think.
Yeah, Marie's right. It has been proven, and the childcare room at Parliament is, as a woman, that really, and being named after Charlotte, who was the baby that was in the arms of her mum, who was booted from Parliament. It does make you so proud that when you see the outcomes of really positive cross-party collaboration, when you put everything else aside, of what can happen. And that's a really obvious, tangible outcome of what can happen. As far as the ideological divides absolutely exist, and they are getting stronger. Absolutely agree with that. How we bridge that, I don't know, again, that bridging that or filling that divide is possible through conversations, but I'm hoping that that things like this, events like this, might be able to facilitate conversations or help people understand that if it is a women's caucus or if it's a group, then there needs to be very, very strong leadership from very, very strong women. And I think all women are strong in their own way. We have to be, right? But I think facilitating those conversations, particularly in the political world, that does need to be facilitated by someone who is very strong, that can, but also very calming at the same time, so that those conversations can flow freely. And even though there is that ideological divide, and we don't want everyone to think the same way, because that's just not how humanity works. We all have our own thoughts and opinions, and we want to be able to facilitate those thoughts and opinions and have those conversations, because that's where great ideas come from. But I think events such as this and others lead to women stepping into leadership roles in a very confident, strong way, and that will be the best way to facilitate those think tanks, I suppose, and lead to really positive outcomes. And yeah, we're starting small with something like Charlotte's Room, but if that then leads to a solution with how rural women that I represent, those rural and remote women out on huge properties, can be at the table when we're having conversations about wind farms or renewable energy that might take place on their farm, and the rules around that are causing some angst with them at the moment. If they can be at the table, then I think that is a huge step in the right direction of actually having those conversations and facilitating some really positive outcomes, or at least including everyone in the conversation so they feel like they've been part of it, and the outcome is something that eventually everyone will be able to agree on. I know that sounds utopian, that everyone could agree, but I think as women we can get there because we can all spell compromise, I think, and that's how we'll move forward.
Thank you. Steph, give us your take on this.
Yeah, look, of course there are different ideologies, but I think what we really need to constantly come back to is that really ideology shouldn't overrule science. And I think one of the most troubling things since I've been in the Senate is seeing really how science is being increasingly sidelined at a time where it needs to be reoriented and reprioritised. And I just don't really see an excuse for ideology to trump listening to the climate science, from acting on climate justice. And ultimately, we do need more STEM experts in that parliament. We need more people with diverse lived experiences. It's a shame Monique couldn't be here today. I would have really liked to hear her perspectives on that as well. But the erosion of science is never more clear than it was last week when we watched our federal nature laws be watered down to protect a multinational corporation industry. And I'm sorry, I just cannot. I can't just see that as an ideological difference. For me, it's just heartbreaking to see that happen at a time when we need to be strengthening these protections as an absolute priority. What I'm encouraged by, is that we are seeing a greater diversity of voices with respect to my colleagues outside of the major parties, who can exercise a conscience vote on these issues. And I'm really proud to be a member of a party that does permit conscience votes, because really, what greater issue of conscience is there than climate injustice? And, I've worked, as I said, in parliamentary groups, cross-party groups. I've worked everything from dying with dignity legislation through to medicinal cannabis, a multitude of issues. And yes, the women in the room, we've agreed wholeheartedly that that things need to change. But then when it comes to sitting in the parliament and they're forced to vote along party lines or be expelled from their party, it's setting us up to fail very early on in the process. So greater numbers of people are voting outside of the major parties than ever before. And I think that they genuinely want that independent representation from within their electorate, and that willingness to put aside the ideology and politics and actually vote for a future that is more fair and more just and more equitable. I've recently watched as my colleague Senator Larissa Waters led an inquiry into menopause, and we saw, that perimenopause had never been mentioned in the Parliament before. She raised it very recently, and women's health is continually sidelined. When we saw this committee report come out, and everyone got behind those recommendations, but then it's putting them into action. We saw this on gambling as well. The late Peter Murphy made some extraordinary developments and led an Senate inquiry that would have removed gambling harm and saved so many families as a consequence. But the recommendations just aren't followed through. So we need more political will, ultimately. We can have more dialogue, have more conversation, but we need to move that into action and to genuinely represent the wants and needs of our communities. Because frankly, I'm out door knocking most weekends. I was out yesterday, and people are switching off. That they don't feel like they are being represented at the moment. Everything from gambling reform to native forest logging to, as I mentioned, the weakening of our environmental protections. They're switching off at a time where we need them to be switching on. And that's one of the really beautiful things about our door knocking efforts and our really grassroots organising model, is that we're so tuned in to what the community wants and expects and needs, and we're trying to reconnect them back into democracy and show them that their voice matters and that they can help translate discussion into action. And I love talking to groups about how they can lobby more effectively and how they can overcome, I suppose, the might and power of some of the really big corporate lobbyists that are literally roaming the halls of Parliament every single week that it's sitting. And so I suppose my call to action, if you're part of a group who wants some tips on what I think are really effective ways to get decision makers to listen to you and to act on your community's interests, then please do reach out to me. But just finally, I'm being part of a global movement. The Greens aren't just a federal party, we're a global movement, and we do have a global Greens Congress that I'm part of, and where the women in the party mentor different potential political candidates from across the global south, and I'm mentoring an incredible Nepalese woman at the moment. So I think it just highlights the need for us to think locally but act globally, and I would love to see us come leaps and strides in my next term of Parliament. And I ultimately do think that more women being elected and more minor party voices is a really important way of getting us there.
Thank you. So none of this is ever going to be easy, it seems really clear, and we were talking yesterday, that we can't resolve climate change through conflict politics. Oppositional politics may be up to a point where it's debate, and that's how our parliamentary system is set up to be, but real conflict is, not going to get us to where we want to be, also because of the short-term election cycles which have been mentioned. Maybe we need to start small with some of these collaborative ventures and see how we can grow them. But I want to go back to something that came up earlier in the first round when you were speaking about even though the women are in the Parliament, sometimes the men still get a bit of a say. And to what extent does that impact your daily experience of being in Murray.
Well, that's also a loaded question, I would say.
Go for it. We're all
yeah,
friends here.
I know. I'm amongst friends, I'm sure. Before I answer that, I just wanted to go to something that Steph referred to in relation to democracy and the democratic process, and how important that is right now in this current global climate, that we sit tightly and hold closely our democracy, because it is so important. And in an age of increasing misinformation and disinformation, particularly in relation to issues surrounding women and the feminist movement and climate change associated with that, it's incumbent on all of us to raise up our voices and confront that and say, we will protect our democratic institutions, we will protect that democratic process, even though the outcomes might not be what we wish sometimes. But the other thing around that, of course, is that across the world there is a narrative that is walking back what has been so hard gained, and that is that diversity, equality, inclusion that we can't afford to lose just because there's a narrative globally that women don't matter, that diverse communities more broadly don't matter, that if you're a migrant, you don't matter, if you're a refugee, you don't matter, if you're a First Nations person, you don't matter. We have to hold fast. Yeah. And it is challenging. It is challenging because I will go now to those voices of the men. So I have the great pleasure and honour of being the speaker, right? So I get to hear a lot of debate in the chamber. I get to hear also a lot of, sorry Jade, mansplaining a lot of the time. And that aggressive behaviour, honestly, I think that we have come to a point in our Victorian Parliament where it has become okay. It's become okay to shout obscenities across the chamber. Where it's
not okay.
Where it's become okay to get kicked out of the chamber because you're not following the rules and wearing it as a badge of honour. And it's mostly blokes. There are some women, of course, but the reality is that there are more women there's 50% women, 50% men in the Victorian Parliament. The majority of women are on the government side, in the Assembly. So it has changed a lot since when I was first elected, when there was the majority men in the chamber. That aggression and that men behaving badly scenario, that I like to call it, was much worse than it is now. So there has been a change in the tone simply because of the sheer numbers of women. And there are some members of Parliament from both sides who often come to me with concern about the behaviour of other members in the Parliament. So, you know, we need to get to a position where respect is restored, where respect is the number one thing that you should take with you when you go into that chamber, or even when you are elected as a member of Parliament. Because if you don't give respect, you don't get respect, right? So there's a lot to be said about men and some of the attitudes that still exist, particularly amongst our male representatives, without singling out anyone. But, you know, there is a general trend across the world of a growing misogyny. And our young women in particular are feeling that. Why would they ever want to be a member of Parliament if they're confronting that every day of their lives on social media and then having to maybe put their hand up to run for Parliament? And can I give a big shout out to the young woman before who's running for the Senate? Like, that's a big deal. That's a big deal when you're only 21 or 22. But there's a lot of conversations to be had around this about how we can do things better. But underpinning all of that is maintaining and strengthening our democracy and our democratic processes.
Thank you. Thank you. I might go to Jade next because she seemed to be nodding quite a bit during the...
Yeah, well,
She hasn't been immune from getting kicked out of the chamber.
I think I'm still out. I did set a new PB last sitting week. Though I got kicked out twice in one day by Marie, both times. So, but I do agree, and there is there is certainly a huge level of mansplaining that goes on. I will say though that the Victorian Nationals have. And this is another great, very obvious example of how far we've come, not only as a party, but I think as a group of people that represent our communities, and that's what we tend to call ourselves now. We don't like to say we're a party. We're just a group of community representatives, and the Victorian Nationals have more women in the party room now than men in the Nationals. You know, that's huge. It wasn't that long ago when Jeanette Powell was the very first National elected to the Legislative Assembly. So that's been a big change in a very short period of time, but again comes from, I think, that community representation and identifying those that are actually, you know, representing communities. There's a long way to go as far as cultural diversity goes. It would be great to see, and I live in a small town called Robinvale, which is a very, very small Murray River town that has, according to the census, about 3,000 people, but there's 86 different languages spoken here. And at my children's school, it's about 200 children, and there's 22 different ethnic backgrounds, including First Nations through to Indonesian, Malaysian. It's extraordinary, and I'm so glad that we get to bring our kids up that way. But as far as in decision-making and the democratic process, and I see this every day too, the mansplaining and the growing misogyny and to the point where I called, and I will call it out, but I think this is definitely a personality issue. I don't stand for it. There are many women, I think, within the Victorian Parliament that will not stand for it and will call it out, and they will call it out not just with regards when us ourselves are feeling it, but when our colleagues are as well. And it won't be tolerated, because if you stand by and you do tolerate it, then you're just allowing it, I guess. But it even gets to the point now when I call out misogyny, they will argue with me saying I'm not being misogynistic, I'm being chauvinistic. I mean, okay, I'm fine. You know, so it's an ongoing battle, but the fact that I've called out, even last week, I got clicked at. Which of course got my my spidey senses going. But even little things like that, like I'm not going to stand for being clicked at. I'd like to see you click at another male colleague. And this is not coming from within it's coming from outside, but within the parliament, and men who should know better. But for the most part, within the Nationals, I mean, there's never been any of that. We're a really great collaborative group and we rib each other. We have differing opinions from one side of the state to the other because we understand that our communities are very, very different. But in our in the wider parliament, the coalition and you know, the differing spectrums, then there is a bit of that going on. But also, I think we need to also acknowledge the fact that I've probably had more aggression come at me from other women. And I think we really need to acknowledge the fact that sometimes it feels a bit like high school. And my bullies from high school now are those ones that I see them in my Insta stories watching all the time, and that's great. But that was stuff that I experienced in high school from other girls. You know, it was the boys that I would go out and kick the footy with and play tennis with, and basketball at lunchtime and recess, while the girls were. I'm hoping that's changing, but I still do get a little bit of that now as a 45-year-old woman in Parliament. It's more subtle. The men are very, very obvious, and, we'll say I'm not being misogynistic, I'm being chauvinistic. Well, at least you accept that. So now that you've accepted it, let's do some self-development to perhaps change. I think there's a couple of different things need to be acknowledged, addressed and worked on by both men and women.
Yeah. Thank you. We need to look after each other as well. Steph, how's it going in the federal parliament?
Look, it is a pretty daunting place. I don't think I'm a middle-aged woman now, nearly 40. Frankly, it's a very intimidating setting. Question time, whenever I've got anyone who wants to come and watch, I really try to deter them because I think it erodes their confidence in the political system rather than enhance it. And hats off to our speaker because it's a really tough job. And look, the structures of Parliament, I think, it's not accidental that they're set up to make it harder for women. Incredibly late night sitting, parliamentary sitting weeks that are scheduled during school holidays. I'm really fortunate that I've got a partner and a mother-in-law that are able to step in and allow me to do this work, and incredible early childhood educators without whom this job wouldn't be possible. Not just for parliamentarians, but for women staff. And you do notice that a lot of the staff working in Canberra are men because women just simply can't afford to be travelling away regularly from their families because of some of those existing structural inequities that they have to confront. The Jenkins Review really did see some significant changes and positive changes happen in how our federal parliament runs. We've got extraordinary help available now, 24 hours a day for people to seek independent counselling advice, independent HR advice. So I think we're seeing a cultural shift for the better. I'm part of a party room, as I mentioned, that's predominantly women, and our policies are very much driven by our entire membership. We don't have captain's calls really in the federal parliament, but of course, in the federal Greens party room, but it's always a question of emphasis. We have a male leader, so sometimes he does need to be reminded, childcare needs to be really prioritised. This is something that it mightn't be on the daily media airstreams every day, but I suppose the women in the party room play a role in ensuring the emphasis is balanced and correct in the different policy areas that we're working on. But you'll see also when you get up in question time and ask a question, many ministers, I would say, aren't necessarily there because of merit-driven reasons. They're there often because of really factional power and relationships. And I think, that's something that I would really like to see shift. Really, there are some extraordinary women who I think really should be sitting on the front bench. Hopefully we see more of them after the next election. I suppose just at a really personal level, politics can, it can beat out a lot of what it attempts to beat out what makes you. And I think the idea of vulnerability is something that really is lacking. And I see as a really important part of my role is to ensure that, I'm allowing myself to be vulnerable, that I'm not being too drawn into the speaking points and making sure you deliver every line perfectly at the expense of, I think, some really important storytelling that needs to happen in order to bring people along with us. Are we talking to Murdoch media or are we talking to the community? And I think every week I sort of have to kind of reorient myself to say, why am I in here? Why am I doing this? Which part of me am I willing to give? Which aren't I? Because you do need to keep some of your life private and then decide how much you're willing to make public. I'm a bit of I do find that line really hard to navigate, especially, and I suppose it's really been brought home that the vitriol and the debate on social media is absolutely appalling at the moment. And it's largely men who are piling on in the most obscene manner online, and it's really quite worrying. Regular death threats, the AFP have been very good at following those up quite promptly, but it's really challenging to sit down in front of a young woman and try to encourage some of the merits of considering a life in Parliament when what they're potentially going to be exposed to very soon. So it's really hard to have that genuine dialogue. We need more great, young, diverse voices in there, but yeah, it feels disingenuous to say that it's a great place to be, because a lot of the time it's not, particularly in the lead up to an election. So yeah, this is an area where I think you'll find like bipartisan, tripartisan support to ensure that we do move towards a culture that's more geared towards women with families as well, and I hope and believe that there's progress that can be made in the next term of Parliament towards that. We've got, as a growing number of women get elected each electoral cycle, but yeah, it's tough. I don't know what else to say beyond that.
Thank you. We feel... So time is going on. Would you be able to stay for an extra 5 minutes because I'd love to take some questions. Are you okay? All the hands are going up. Just to say, we want to continue the conversation in this same way that we've been doing, respectful, listening, exploring how women can work well together. So I'd love the questions to be...
I will kick anyone out who is
Yes, that's right. Oh, I didn't see which hand went up first. I think maybe it was... I've forgotten your name for a moment. We've got the two microphones here.
I've got.
Yep.
Hi, thank you to each of you. Steph mentioned the power of the lobbyists marching the halls of Parliament, and it's really heartening to hear. Jade, you've mentioned it a lot, the community that you represent and the bigger picture for you around care for the whole. But how are we ever going to get care for the whole when care economies, when the environment, when future generations are voiceless and, don't have any potential to generate tax income? Or it just seems to me an intractable issue that politics is essentially basically selling out to the lobbyists and the monetary, powers of tax generation.
Should I jump in there? Steph and Jade, you okay with that? I have the microphone, so you have no choice, right? Look, tax policy obviously is mostly a federal issue. But in terms of voices and having voices heard, particularly in relation to what we're all here for today, and that is climate change and how to address it and how to mitigate it and how to support communities and families and women and children across the sector, there are ways of doing that. And I don't think that anyone should be not able to have a voice when policy changes are being made or implemented. And I just want to put on the table that right now the Victorian government is undertaking its second climate change strategy, and that is a consultation process. And I would encourage all of you to put in a submission to that, because then your voices are actually being heard when it comes to how we address climate change and what strategies we need to have for the next 5 years. So the first strategy is coming to an end. That framework, that 5-year framework that we had in place is coming to an end. The next 5 years will make a big difference in this state and how we approach climate change. That strategy is so important. Just though, submissions do close on the 8th of April, so you have to be a little bit quick. But I think these are the ways that we can actually allow people to have their voices heard, because it's open to anyone to actually have a say in that process. And there are lots of other processes that happen where we encourage people from across the sectors, from across the board, to have their say when governments, even parties for that matter, are developing policies and strategies for the future.
Maybe I jump in?
Yeah.
Yeah, look, excitingly, Gen Z and millennial voters for the first time are going to outnumber, for want of a better phrase, baby boomers this election. So, votes speak volumes to our leaders. We've been campaigning to lower the voting age to 16 for a really long time now because, frankly, people are working by the age of 16. They often, paying tax, they're contributing. They're going to be the beneficiaries of this planet. They're in the future. So the Greens have 25 young people under the age of 35 running across Victoria alone this election. So do really, I suppose, my call to action, go and look at who's running to represent you. Look if they're going to bring those unique and diverse voices to the parliament, whether they're going to bring that intergenerational lens and lived experience as a young person when you go to vote, because really that place is dominated by older white men. Like, yes, we're getting more women elected, but still older white men who lack that diversity of experience, and frankly, I think are too beholden to those lobbying interests, those fossil fuel donations that we've spoken about. This election is going to be incredibly close nationally, and there's a very strong chance of a minority government. And really what we want to see is a minority government where we can get some of the reforms that we saw after the 2010 election, which was massive investment in clean energy through Clean Energy Finance Corporation. It was getting dental care for kids into Medicare. Let's expand that. I think I'll go back to my original point that the more diversity of voices and the more young people who are in there at the negotiating table, the greater chance that we've got of rectifying some of these wrongs and ensuring that this planet can be enjoyed for generations after our own.
Thank you. Jade, do you want to?
Yeah, really quickly. Talk to the candidates. There are pathways for having your voices heard. I mean, any candidate that's running to represent your electorate should be your voice for everyone, not just for people who vote for them, whether they're independent, Nationals, Liberal, Labor. The elected representative, and this gets back to that whole protection of democracy, is there to represent the entire community. So go and meet the candidates. When there's candidate forums, there's people out there, talk to them, get to meet them, and you will know, depending on where your radar is for a good judge of character, and we don't like to be too judgmental very quickly, but I think you can with candidates. There will be a very big difference. And you will, if you get to know them, go and meet them rather than just read, believe everything you read in the paper. Don't believe everything, believe very little of what you see on socials and things like that. I just urge people, go out and meet the different candidates and vote for those that you think will listen to you first and foremost, and then represent you properly. And the lived experience that Steph spoke about is also, I think, really, really important. When I was first approached to join the Nationals, and it was Peter Walsh at the time, I said to him, I don't think this, and I was on local government, I said, I don't think politics is for me. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an accountant, I'm not from that world. And he said, good, because we don't need any more lawyers, we don't need any more accountants, we need people that have had lived experience and have lived a colourful life. And I went, yep, all right, well, that's more like me then. There's a story for everything. And so I think that is also really important. So the best way that I think you can have your voices heard, particularly with elections coming up, is go and talk to the candidates, go and meet them, shake their hand. Every candidate will be willing to do that. That is what they do during the campaign period. So go and meet them and make sure you're voting for who best represents you.
Thank you. We've got, I'm going to take two questions. I'm going to take Meg, there's Meg and then Rachel. We might take those two questions and then we'll see where that takes us. Yeah.
Okay. It's partly a reflection about the listening across ideologies, I suppose, and maybe a comment to us in this Congress of how difficult sometimes it is to listen when we're also really passionate about our positions. And something that I remember Cathy McGowan saying when she first was elected as member for Indi, and was saying that she had a very strong rule for herself that she would never herself say anything personally about any other member of Parliament, and that when she started having volunteers coming sort of for a week experience in Canberra, that she had this really strong thing that she would not allow anyone to say anything about anybody personally. And I think that's, I think it's so important. And when we tend to be possibly many of us on one side of a debate, I think it's really important that we listen and really hear what other people have to say. And I was just, I suppose, maybe that's a comment more than a question.
Thank you. We might take we'll take Rachel's question as well, and then we'll see how that develops us.
First, I want to acknowledge all three of you because it's very, very clear, and I've known this before from all sorts of places, what a challenge it is to be a woman in Parliament. So I want to thank you for your courage ongoingly. Following along from that, Steph, you said something which I think is absolutely critical. And that is that, yes, it's brilliant and it's made changes that there's more women in Parliament, and that is fantastic. However, that you are getting stopped at the higher levels. So my question, and I guess my gentle challenge to all of you, is what actions can you take? How can we as women support you so that your voices and your decisions can get carried through without being blocked by men, without being blocked by the multinational interests that obviously line your halls every day? So how can we do that? Because without that, it seems to me that our voices are going to be stopped. So that seems a really, really important question. And I also take on board how important it is to show respect to the diversity. And perhaps think about David Suzuki's idea of, rather than always looking at the different positions, what do we want to envision, all of us? Because I think that can sometimes bring people together across the differences. So I'm putting that as acknowledgement and challenge and support.
Thank you. Thank you for those two questions. So I'm a bit mindful of time, so if we go to everyone to answer those questions, then I think that might need to be the sort of winding up remarks as well, if that's... So... Me? I go to you.
Okay, I get to go first again, sorry.
Well, we can do it another way around.
No, that's fine, that's fine. Firstly, Meg, thank you. That was a very interesting statement, because one of the things that I am very conscious of, that it is very hard, particularly for women and disadvantaged women even more so, for minority groups in particular, to advocate. And to advocate in a way that makes a difference. I just, this weekend we are celebrating Bendigo Pride Festival, and I spoke on a panel to a group of young gender diverse and transgender people to talk about advocacy. And the questions that they asked were so profound about how can our voices be heard when no one wants to listen to us. And it's so challenging. And, there are tips and there are ways of doing that, but there is nothing better than that face-to-face conversation. And to say to someone, if, you're advocating and you're not being heard, or you're getting responses that are bureaucratic gobbledygook, you say, I don't understand. Can you please explain that to me in simpler terms? It is challenging though, and I appreciate that. To Rachel's question around how do we stop that? Well, here in Victoria we have a woman premier, and that has made a hell of a difference to how the state is being treated in the way that, in particular, women's health has become front and centre. And the investment in women's health and acknowledging women's pain when it comes to women's health has been a huge step forward for women in this state. Well ahead of the federal government and their responses to endometriosis. We were way ahead of that. We actually had a women's pain forum and we asked for submissions. It was the highest number of submissions ever for any policy. And as a consequence of that, the investment in women's health has gone through the roof. So it does make a difference. So if you've got a woman at the leadership level, it does make make a difference. And I'd like to think, and maybe Jade might have a different opinion on this, but I'd like to think that having a woman speaker in the chamber makes a huge difference as well. Simply because, I think I'm a bit scary sometimes, I'm not sure, but I think the moderation of the challenge is changed. The dynamic has changed. And I am only the 4th woman speaker in 170 years. So we still have a very long way to go. And Jacinta is only the 2nd woman premier in this state. It is something that we all need to be mindful of, that women in leadership positions can and do make change. At the local level, just here in my own electorate, there's myself, Bendigo West, Jacinta Allen, Bendigo East, and we also have Lisa Chesters, who is our federal member. So we also have a woman mayor in both Mount Alexander Shire and Bendigo. So women in leadership positions do make a difference because they can challenge that status quo where men might come in over the top and say, "Nah, you can't do that. That doesn't work for us." So it does make a difference, absolutely. And thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. I think, Victoria in the room might know better than me, but I think there's some research that shows that actually you have to have 2/3 of women in the room before you really have an impact. So I have been rather going the same way around every time, so I might go to Steph now instead of...
Yeah, look, thank you so much, Meg, for your words of encouragement, but also that really important question. And what I would say, ways to support us is really through organising in your communities. And, the particular example I used was the federal environment laws. And don't underestimate the value of a phone call, of a letter, of an email, of a social media comment or a share. Every little one does matter, and particularly I'll say for me, handwritten letters, they often end up in front of me. So if you can organise like letter writing workshops, if you can organise, if you've got friends or colleagues who live in the electorate of the particular decision maker, namely the Prime Minister in this example, organise them and make sure that you do that in advance of a decision where there's capacity to do so, but then also afterwards. And if they shift, and if there's an MP within a party making the right sounds and signals, write to them and congratulate them, because similarly they need to know that it's worth going out, putting their neck out on whatever issue it might be if it's not popular within their own political party. Join local groups who are advocating. I'm sure these are things that you're already doing, but I just want to say, as a decision maker and I wish I had a bit more power to make decisions, but we have a balance of power in the Senate. Every bit of feedback from the community really does matter. Ultimately, money matters a lot to political parties, so it's hard. It feels sometimes like overwhelming and impossible to compete with these huge donations, but I think the only thing that speaks equally is the threat of electoral loss. Your money's not very helpful, and there's only so much you can spend. But if the community's against you, they'll see a shift, and they're seeing shifts in that area. So maybe it's a bit cheeky to say this after what I was just saying earlier, but if you're completely unsatisfied, you've tried those organising tactics, you've voted against them, consider running as a candidate yourself. We're seeing so many extraordinary independents coming through to represent their communities, and so it's daunting. Find a mentor. I've got some wonderful people that I chat to about being a candidate every single week, and do consider it, because often, or if you see someone else in your network that you think would make a wonderful representative, tap them on the shoulder. I was tapped on the shoulder a few years ago, and I would never have thought that I had the skills and experience required to be a politician. Oh, that word politician still sort of has the irks at the moment, but often it takes someone just hearing a bit of encouragement from someone that they admire to take the step and to put their hand up and to represent, whether it's in a political level, whether it's community leadership level, a board level. Do just encourage those women around you, and don't just expect and assume that they feel experienced and competent to do the role, even if you see them in that way. We all have a responsibility to be empowering young women around us, and to be supporting them once they've made that decision. So I suspect you're already very active. I want to say a humongous thank you to the organisers for bringing us together today, to my fellow panellists for being for adding richness to this conversation. I would love to keep this conversation going post-election. It's a very busy 5 weeks, but if anyone in the audience does want to reach out and get a coffee after the election, please don't hesitate to do so. We've strengthened numbers, and we've got huge issues in front of us, and it's really that network of women that I put around me that insulate me against the crap and keep me motivated to overcome some of those obstacles and to harness some of those opportunities. So thank you for the opportunity to be here, and look forward to continuing the dialogue.
Thank you. Okay, and Jade?
Yeah, really quickly, going back to something that Marie said, yes, she is scary, and scarier than most of the men in that chamber. Most of the time. I'm scared of Marie more than I'm scared of any of the blokes in there, I will say that. There's one person in there that will make me be quiet and sit up straight, and it is Marie. So, yes. But also, yeah, reach out. Talk to your representatives. There's nothing, and I said earlier, there's nothing that beats a face-to-face conversation. And if you still feel like you want to be heard, and again, I can only speak from the experiences that I've had with the Nationals, but I joined because I felt like we weren't at a state level being represented the way we should have been. And the best way that I found for not just mine, but people that were talking to me through the local government channels was to join the party that I'm most identified with and get in the inside and start creating policies from there. So that's also another option if you're that way inclined. But engage with your representatives is the best way to be heard and to be represented, because again, I'm a bit like Steph. I hate the tag politician, because I'm not. We're community representatives, and that's what we should be first and foremost. So us being community representatives, the door is always open. The email is always there. There's always a phone call to be had. And if you still feel like you're not being heard, then, run as a candidate or join the political party that you most align with. Get on the inside and make action happen, because but once you're there as well, like we all are, support in whether it is carrying on those conversations. I'm one that, because I am a community representative, I will go out and talk to people when there's different issues coming up. I will find those people. So if you're engaging with me and my office on different issues and something is coming up for debate in the chamber, I'll go and find those people, those groups, those organisations that are representative of my community. Not on a larger scale, but there is always clusters of people that are having these discussions within your community. So we also need to be very proactive as well to come and find you. So, but it goes both ways. So, and then, if you're still not happy, become a member or run as a candidate.
Thank you. Well, we have gone quite a lot over time, so thank you very much for your time and your contributions, your very honest and open contributions to this conversation. I think it's much appreciated. And Liz, don't worry, because we're going to make up the time and the workshop's going to... Yes, Women's Climate Congress has got a proposal for the federal parliament after the election for a parliamentary women's caucus on climate change. If they did have such a thing, it would be a world first. I think that it's a challenge. I'll be taking that up with you, Steph, after. And I did hear quite a lot of common ground being exchanged here today. If you want to start a caucus, it sounds like you could start around talking about the men and then build up from there. But anyway, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you. Thanks for the invitation.